Trump is now saying we have this massive card we can play geopolitically, which is that so many countries are dependent on our market. So we should weaponize that, like we weaponize the dollar. And we're going to use tariffs as a geopolitical tool. We're in this era where the US government is saying that we are reasserting our imperial sphere of influence in Latin America and reimposing the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which is an explicitly colonial doctrine. Since the 2000s, the plurality of debt held by developing countries is owed to private creditors, is owed to Wall Street. Maybe Trump will find a way to negotiate a formal treaty to the end of the war. I'm still skeptical because there's no way Europe's going to go along with this. The thing is that whole system is being disrupted now, and it's impossible to predict what will happen.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts given in the description link in the description below. But the least you can do is to watch the show, hit a like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Ben Norton. Ben is a journalist, political commentator, and the main person behind the amazing YouTube platform Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, welcome back to India and Global Left.
It's always a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So much to discuss. I want to jump right in with what Bloomberg is calling Trumpnomics. And effectively, there are two major pillars. One is the trade war, and the other is the fiscal policy, bringing down debt to GDP ratio and fiscal deficit. So let's start with the trade, or what is now called the tariff war. What's your impression, early analysis about what's going on?
Completely schizophrenic and contradictory. Now, there are a few things to pick apart here. I know you want to talk about the trade deficit. I'll talk about the fiscal deficit. So Trump says he wants to cut the fiscal deficit. He has this whole Doge thing I know you want to talk about later. I don't think that's going to happen. I think this is all distraction, and they're focusing on small government programs. And meanwhile, he's going to have massive tax cuts that result in adding trillions of dollars to the deficit. This is, very clear. This is what Ronald Reagan did in the 80s. He talked about, cutting the welfare state and all of this. And actually, the U.S. government deficit as a percentage of GDP increased under Reagan. So I think that's a big distraction. Now, as for the trade deficit, this is much more complicated. And Trump has made this a huge priority, and I think that this is something he actually genuinely does want to do. The reason I started with the fiscal deficit is every time a Republican's in power, they always talk about the fiscal deficit when the Democrats are in power, but when they come to power, they increase the fiscal deficit because they don't actually care about the fiscal deficit. This is all just when Democrats are in power, it's a way of justifying attacking spending programs and such. But so I don't think Trump's serious about reducing the fiscal deficit, but I think he is very serious about reducing the trade deficit. Whether or not he can, I think, is a whole other question. But this is something that he's been talking about for decades. Back when he was just a public personality and a TV host, he was always focused on this. And now, if Trump were actually committed to ending the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, I think it would be possible, and it would be a good thing, actually, because the U.S. designed the global financial system in a way after World War II, but especially after 1971, when Nixon ended the link of the dollar to gold. The system was designed in a way, as Michael Hudson famously showed in his book Super Imperialism, where the U.S. ran a larger and larger chronic current account deficit, a trade deficit with the rest of the world, which provided the rest of the world with the dollars needed to pay for imports of oil because the petrodollar replaced essentially the gold backing of the dollar. And countries around the world needed dollars to pay for imports to trade and to pay off their debt, because you have the rise of the euro dollar financial system where countries around the world take on debt in dollars. So the US had to maintain a current account deficit, a balance of payments deficit, to provide the liquidity of dollars needed to finance the system. Now, we have talked a lot about why this system has been bad for the global south, why the system has been beneficial for Wall Street, but been bad for the global majority. So I think it would be good if the system ended, but Trump doesn't want to end it. Trump wants to have his cake and eat it too. Trump has said that he wants the dollar to remain the global reserve currency. He even has repeatedly threatened countries that de-dollarize with 100% tariffs. He also threatened BRICS countries with 100% tariffs. And he thinks Spain is part of BRICS, apparently. Well, the point is that you cannot have these two policies coexist. If he wants to reduce the chronic U.S. current account deficit and reindustrialize, he has to end the status of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, which would be great. I hope he does that, but I don't think he's going to do that. And I've been constantly saying that look at the people around Trump. Look at his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, a hedge fund billionaire. There are 13 billionaires in the Trump administration, tons of people from Wall Street. These are people who are not going to challenge the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency in order to reindustrialize the US, because that would go against their own economic interests of Wall Street, which has been the chief beneficiary of the deindustrialization of the US and the financialization of the US economy. So Trump says that he's going to try to reduce the US trade deficit through the use of tariffs, which I don't think this is going to work either, because he's floating, blanket tariffs at first, now 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the two largest US trading partners, and then an additional 10% tariff on China, which he has already gone through. But he temporarily suspended the tariffs on Mexico and Canada. I mean, 80% of Mexico's exports and nearly 80% of Canada's exports go to the US. So this would be devastating for both of their economies. But it would also be very bad for the US, for at least US consumers, because look at the things that Canada exports to the US. Canada exports a lot of oil, timber, minerals. I mean, they're just increasing the cost of all of these primary inputs that are needed for the rest of the economy. Look at what Mexico exports to the US, because when the US deindustrialized and offshored, of course, there was a lot of investment that went to China and Southeast Asia, but there was also a lot of investment, especially after NAFTA passed in 1994, that went to northern Mexico. And Mexico's largest exports to the US are things like cars, engines, machines. So Trump says he wants to reindustrialize, but putting 25% tariffs on Mexican exports is not going to magically help the US reindustrialize, because despite the tariffs, those products coming from Mexico are still going to be cheaper than similar products produced domestically in the United States. Trump thinks that if you just put tariffs on, you magically reindustrialize. You actually need a very comprehensive industrial policy. If you look at the industrial policy of a country like China or Vietnam or even Singapore, even South Korea, they have very sophisticated, advanced industrial policies that not only include infant industry protections through targeted tariffs in specific industries, not blanket tariffs, targeted tariffs. They also have significant funding on research and development, which is being cut by Doge and Elon Musk. They have significant subsidies, which maybe Trump will continue with subsidies. He's fine with that, or maybe not. They have, also investment in infrastructure, because in order to reindustrialize and to create these factories, and you need energy, you need plants, you need very significant investment in infrastructure. We know that U.S. infrastructure is falling apart. The point is, industrial policy is much more comprehensive. It's very large. You also need trained workers. You need to have, this cannot happen overnight. You need to spend years training, developing the human capital needed to actually work in these factories, which are very advanced these days. I mean, I've had the privilege of being able to see some Chinese EV factories, and they're very robotized, mechanized, automated. It's not like the old style of the 1960s where you have all these guys in a Ford plant in Detroit. These plants today are much more sophisticated, and you need at least, months or even years to train workers to do all of this. Magically putting tariffs on does not solve the problem. All it does is it encourages these companies to find other countries to source their supply chain from. And this is why what we're actually seeing is what's known as nearshoring or friendshoring, right? So in Trump's first term, he put tariffs on China, and what happened? Chinese companies invested more in Vietnam and Mexico and Brazil and other countries, and then they export to the US, right? So this idea that tariffs can be this magical solution, I think it's not going to happen. In fact, Trump put tariffs on China the first time, and what happened to the U.S. current account deficit? It increased, and the U.S. trade deficit with China increased. So I think overall, I'm actually not against at all this idea of reducing the U.S. trade deficit and reindustrializing. I think that if there were an actual left-wing government that came to power, this should be part of the program, is reindustrializing, challenging finance, challenging Wall Street, reindustrializing the country, bringing green industrialization, building electric vehicles and solar panels and wind turbines. That would be great. But you would have to have it as part of a much larger industrial policy, a state-led campaign that would have to challenge the financial interests of Wall Street first and foremost. Trump is having like this half-baked contradictory policy where he wants to have his cake and eat it too, keep the dollar as the reserve currency, help Wall Street, serve Wall Street, but also reindustrialize. One side has to lose, and I think it's going to be Wall Street that wins.
You mentioned about the global south. One of the things that differentiates Trump's tariff war, actually, it's not tariff war, it's more than that, because they are talking about currency, the reciprocal basis, country by country. I mean, it's a overturning of the term reciprocal, because earlier under the WTO, reciprocal meant lowering tariffs, but now reciprocal means we would impose the same. So they're talking about revisiting VAT, the value-added tax in Europe. They're talking about other non-tariff barriers, currency policies, and so on and so forth. So it's a all-out trade war and not tariff war. But the distinguishing element this time is that it's all out and it's not limited to China, which was more or less the dominating thing during the first Trump years. And I was interested to ask you one question about the global south, since you mentioned and you also follow. Actually, if you look at the net tariff map globally, Mexico and Canada was such a fraud. That was basically more about immigration and drug import. It was never about tariff, because the net tariff in these countries are same because they are under NAFTA. With China, net tariff imposed by China is less than what the United States does. There are maps now prepared by the Financial Times, Bloomberg, very clear, where the net tariffs are higher and understandably are in the global south countries. So India have higher net tariffs vis-a-vis the United States. Much of Latin America has higher, with some exceptions of Chile. West and East Africa have higher net tariffs. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think might be possible responses of the global south? One response might be to individually bargain with the United States and try to minimize the damage and kind of strike a balance between protection and trading. And the other is to build more south-south connections and also finding domestic alternatives to global trade. I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Well, it's very complicated because the U.S., again, when it essentially designed the global financial system in a way in which the U.S. chronically runs these massive current account deficits and then sucks in all of the excess production of countries around the world. It became this big market. The U.S. imports everything. Workers around the world, their surplus value is extracted to create these products, and then they're sent to the United States, and then the U.S. pays by printing more money and sending dollars around the world, and those dollars are invested in U.S. Treasury securities, helping to finance the U.S. deficit, or they're invested in U.S. stocks, which pushes up a big rally in U.S. stock prices in the S&P 500, or it goes into the euro dollar market and finances these countries in the global south which want to borrow because they need to borrow in order to fund infrastructure projects and industrialize, but then they end up borrowing in dollars in U.S. usually, but also maybe in British capital markets, and they sell dollar-denominated sovereign bonds, and then they have debt crises like in Argentina and Ghana, and the list goes on. So that system is being disrupted. And I mean, there are good things about that system being disrupted, but like I said, Trump doesn't want to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. So I think it's going to be much more chaotic and devastating and destructive. And I think honestly, the global south, I mean, as you mentioned, it makes sense that many of these countries in the global south have, on average, higher net tariffs because the US is the one that has been preaching free trade for decades. I mean, this is so funny because now the US under Trump is being seen as the carrying the banner of protectionism, but it's always the dominant economic power that has preached free trade. This goes back to the 19th century when the British Empire ended the Corn Laws and began preaching free trade and imposing free trade on the colonies. And as Ha-Joon Chang, the great South Korean development economist, famously showed in his book Kicking Away the Ladder, he said that the time in before the neoliberal era, you know, in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the time in history in which there was the most free trade in the world was the peak of European colonialism in the late 19th century. And why was there so much free trade? Because so much of the world was colonized by the European colonial powers, which imposed free trade on their colonies. The British imposed free trade on India, which deindustrialized India. Before British colonialism, India had a very advanced textile industry. It was deindustrialized by the British Empire, so India could send cheap, you know, raw materials and primary commodities to the core, and then the British Empire would export its advanced manufactures to India. And so that was the system that benefited the imperial powers. And then we had this strange moment of neoliberal globalization where the US voluntarily deindustrialized itself because it said it was in its comparative advantage, essentially, to be the banker of the world, right? I mean, essentially, you know, if you go back to David Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage, the famous case being the British, you know, England creating textiles and Portugal creating wine. Well, essentially, what that argument led to is the relative deindustrialization, or at least the much better industrialization and advanced manufacturing in England compared to Portugal. Because if you say, well, it's in your comparative advantage to constantly simply export low value added products, you're never going to move up the global value chain. And what you have is a solidification of a global division of labor. And this goes back to, you know, the 50s and 60s and the dependency theorists and Raul Prebisch, right? The founder of UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. The whole point was that economists in Latin America, like him, Nelson Furtado in Brazil as well, but also Raul Prebisch being like the banner carrier of infant industry protection and in particular import substitution industrialization, right? This was the global South's, you know, main economic idea. Aside from, you know, of course you have socialism and anti-colonial national liberation struggles, but in terms of, you know, dependency theory, the idea was we want to get out of this global division of labor where we simply export iron ore and agricultural products to the US and Europe and Japan, and they create all the manufactured goods and then they export it to us. So fast forward, the US after World War II was the dominant industrial power in the world, largely because the industrial manufacturing capabilities of Europe, of Japan, of the Soviet Union were all destroyed in World War II. The US was basically completely fine. So the US was the dominant industrial power in the world, and the US at that time had a big current account surplus because it was exporting. And then they created the Marshall Plan to provide the liquidity needed to Europe, one, to prevent Europe from becoming communist, and two, to make sure that Europe had the dollars it needed to buy US exports. And then what happened in the neoliberal era, new technologies were developed, and also the Soviet Union was weakened. And it was clear that the Soviet Union was, you know, going to be eventually overthrown, and the US was going to win the first Cold War. So capital no longer needed to make all of these concessions to labor like it had done from, you know, in the Keynesian golden era from roughly, you know, 45 to 79 or whatever, 81. So then capital is on the offensive. They destroy the welfare state. They destroy unions. They deindustrialize. They have new technologies that they can use for offshoring and outsourcing production to other countries. And then it was in the US comparative advantage, according to the neoliberals, to no longer be the major industrial power, but to be the financial power, which is actually kind of similar to what happened to the British Empire. And it never deindustrialized to the same degree, but the British Empire also eventually financialized. And the city of London played the kind of role that Wall Street would eventually play, although not nearly to the same level. Where today, where you now see that the U.S. stock market is 60 to 70% of the entire world's market capitalization of all the stock markets on Earth. I mean, it's incredible. If you look at, if you look at indexes like the main global index used for global stock markets, not just S&P 500, but the global stock markets, the U.S. stock market alone is like 60 to 70% of that index. So it was in the comparative advantage, according to them, of the U.S. to become the banker and financier of the world. And now here we are where the U.S. is trying to disrupt all of that. So, I mean, that wasn't really directly answering your question, but the point I'm getting at is that that whole system is being disrupted now, and it's impossible to predict what will happen. I mean, like I said, I'm skeptical that the U.S. will completely abandon this position that it had as the financier and the banker of the world, and that it will reindustrialize. I don't think that's going to happen because Trump's not pursuing the policies that he would need to actually do that. But it's only further incentivizing countries in the global south to return to import substitution industrialization. Honestly, I think that would be good. There's this idea that ISI, import substitution industrialization, was really bad because in Argentina and Brazil, all of their cars were really bad and their engines. That's not entirely true. I mean, there are elements of truth in that, of course, but this is what neoliberals have always said. Look at Brazil. Actually, Brazil was a major leader in the 60s and 70s in global production of engines, of airplane equipment. It's been really deindustrialized, and today, Brazil, a lot of its economy relies on exporting agricultural products, beef, timber, iron ore. Like these countries, I mean, again, like it's so funny because we're in this weird situation in the world where Trump and the far right are the ones arguing in support of protectionism. So it leads some people on the left to say maybe we should, oppose tariffs and protectionism. But the left has never been in support of free trade. But of course, what Trump's doing is, like you said, it's not really protectionism. It's really weaponization of trade. He's saying that, look, this system we created in which the U.S. is the market of last resort. If you can't sell your products, you just export them to the U.S. We want to weaponize that, like we weaponized the dollar, right? So after 9/11, the U.S. weaponized the dollar and started imposing more and more sanctions on countries around the world. First, it was Iran, and then some people said, well, actually, the sanctions on Iran go back to after the revolution. But the point is that, in the so-called war on terror, the expansion of sanctions in some countries said, okay, well, this is simply related to U.S., national security. And then it expanded to sanctioning, Venezuela, and then they kept expanding it further, and then they seized $300 billion in euros worth of Russian assets, and then they said, well, okay, the U.S. is clearly weaponizing its currency. Okay, that's been bipartisan. Trump is now saying, we have this massive card we can play geopolitically, which is that so many countries are dependent on our market. So we should weaponize that, like we weaponize the dollar. And we're going to use tariffs as a geopolitical tool, like you said, like what he did to Mexico and Canada. It's not really about trade. I mean, I do think Trump does want to reduce the U.S. trade deficit because he's been talking about it for so many decades. But he's not just doing that. He's using that very powerful role that the U.S. plays in the global financial system as a weapon against other countries and saying, if I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to threaten tariffs on you to force you to go along with what I want. He did this to Colombia. I mean, that was a clear example, threatening massive tariffs on Colombia. So the point I'm getting at is that it's so hard, it's impossible to predict what will happen because the U.S. designed this system in a way that benefited itself, at least benefited the capitalist class. It didn't benefit, of course, workers in the Rust Belt. But now the U.S. is just throwing all of these wrenches in the gears of the system that it created, and who know, no one knows what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I like the idea that you compared it with the financial sanctions blackmailing. So it does come up as using trade a massive, enormous U.S. leverage on global trade as a way to blackmail individual countries, and that's where the reciprocal lies. It's not coming up with a global framework that can be challenged under WTO, that can be accountable to international norms, but it's like reciprocal. And so you don't like something, you can blackmail a country. It's very simple. I wanted to discuss last pillar on Trump economics, Trumpnomics, as they say, about cutting down fiscal deficit and bringing down debt to GDP ratio. I looked up, did a little bit of calculation, and something I wanted to share is that about 75% of federal spending it goes on what has been classified as mandatory spending, Medicaid, social securities, and so on. So that leaves with just 25% spending. And out of that, roughly 50 to 60% goes on military. So that means we are really talking about a very small number, maybe like $300 billion annually. So even if like Elon Musk slaughters all of that $300 billion, which is impossible, but even then it's not leading to $1 trillion, maybe over 4 years. But that would like bring down GDP or debt to GDP ratio from 130% to maybe like 120%. A massive part of it is debt financing, which they have to keep the treasury bond market alive. And so you're going to pay. There is a study, I think it was Goldman Sachs, I guess, or Bloomberg's, that says that by 2036, at this rate, it's 4% of the fiscal deficit would go up to 6%, but 4% of that would be just debt servicing. So even if you're not spending on social security, 4% of that is just debt financing. So I don't know if you have heard about 333. They're talking about 3% growth, which is extremely high because like the best numbers are like 2.1, 2.2, like, and that's like an unprecedented circumstance. The projections are realistic projections are 1.76, 1.7, but they're talking about 3%. They're talking about 3 million barrels of crude oil every day, and bringing down fiscal deficit to 3%, which are like completely unrealistic. So what is this Doge about then? Because the more practical way to see Doge as a screw to re-engineer the treasury market and the fiscal deficit, but the numbers are so unrealistic that one has to think about ulterior motives about Doge. So I just wanted to have your response on Doge and the billionaire-headed Doge.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the point to emphasize. This is what I began our discussion with. It's a distraction. I will go out there and bet on this. I guarantee you that the federal deficit as a percentage of GDP under Trump will increase. It will not decrease. It will increase. It's the same thing Ronald Reagan did. They focus on spending that is honestly pennies compared to what you mentioned. If you take this US government spending on Social Security, on healthcare and Medicaid, on Veterans Affairs, on military, if you take them all together, it's nearly 100, it's around 100% of receipts, very close to 100% of receipts. So, and Trump said during his campaign, he's not going to cut Social Security and Medicaid. I'm obviously not saying he should. I'm not saying, but the point is that he knows that he would lose a lot of votes. The Republicans would lose a lot of voters if they did that, considering especially how disproportionately elderly people in the U.S. vote compared to young people, right? Turnout's already low anyway, but especially among young people. He's not going to do that.
There are very concrete studies now that a large sections of Trump voters were recipients of federal aid since COVID and so on.
Of course. So what do they do? They focus on, look, we gave a few $1 million in condoms to Gaza, Mozambique. At first, they claimed it was Gaza, Palestine, but then it was Gaza, Mozambique. So they focus on these few areas that are just a distraction, and they get all their base angry and riled up. And look, we're wasting all this money on helping foreigners. Meanwhile, Trump is going to cut taxes more on the rich. He's going to further cut taxes on corporations. This is just classic right-wing fake populism. You rile up your base, you distract them with, all of these cultural issues and culture war and whatever. And meanwhile, you give huge checks to the rich. And by the way, Tesla is getting a $400 million contract from the State Department. So I mean, it's just honestly, it's corruption, but it's class war. By the way, we're talking about tariffs. What are tariffs? Tariffs are essentially a taxation on imports. Now, Trump says that he's going to force other countries to pay tariffs. Like he said, he was going to force Mexico to pay for the wall. A complete lie. No, it's not how tariffs work. It's U.S. importers who pay for tariffs. It's consumers at the end of the day who pay for tariffs. And in particular, we all know from Basic Economics 101 that the marginal propensity to consume for lower income people is much higher than for rich people. Because obviously, if you have $10 billion and Trump cuts your taxes and you get another $1 billion in wealth, you have $11 billion, it's not going to change your spending habits at all. You're already a billionaire. If you're a massive corporation, it's not going to make you invest more. They're already spending, at least until the AI boom, excluding the AI boom until recently, over 90% of the net income of companies in the S&P 500 went to spending. They spent more than 90% of their net income on stock buybacks and dividends, not on investment. Investment is at the lowest levels in modern history, again, until the AI boom, which is something very different. We are seeing some investment there. So the point is that Trump says he's going to, cut, or actually Elon Musk says he's going to cut the deficit. A distraction. They're not going to cut the deficit. They're going to increase the deficit by reducing taxes on the rich and on big corporations. And meanwhile, it's moving taxes. It's moving the tax burden from the rich to the poor and working class, because tariffs are going to result in an increase in taxation essentially on the consumption of working class people who will have to pay more for the consumer goods and products they buy. And so this is essentially reducing the tax burden on capital, increasing the tax burden on labor. I mean, it's the same class war as always. Now, you raise another very important point about this, about the treasury market. This is another very big aspect of this, because if you look at the U.S. deficit, where it comes from, we already talked about how about 100% of receipts comes from Social Security, Medicare, military, and veterans benefits. This is not just me. It's not just people on the left pointing this out. This is not just political. Luke Gromen was a financial analyst, very good, kind of libertarian leaning. He's been pointing this out for a long time. Lynn Alden has been pointing this out. They're really good financial analysts. Different politics, but they're good financial analysts and very serious. And they've been saying this for months. It's not going to happen. Now, I think you raised a really important point about the treasury market. Scott Bessent, who of course is a hedge fund billionaire, he's made it clear. He said it recently in an interview that the Trump administration's focus is on bringing down the yield on the 10-year treasury security. Because, as you mentioned, one area that they can control, because Trump already said he's not going to cut Social Security and Medicare. It would be politically toxic for him to cut veterans affairs. He's not going to do that. He's floating the possibility of the military. Yeah, I highly doubt that's going to happen. No way. I mean, that's just, again, it's red meat for his base. It's not going to happen. But in terms of the interest expense, that's something that they can control. And Trump himself said that he wants to reduce interest rates, which are very high, of course, at least relatively speaking, compared to after the 2008 financial crisis when we were in the zero interest rate period, ZIRP, right? So interest rates are still pretty high. And the 10-year treasury yield has been very high, especially in October 2023. There was a big crisis in the treasury market because the treasury yield went to 5%. And people were freaking out. They were saying this could be like a Liz Truss moment, right? Let's not forget that it was Liz Truss came in with this, Reagan-esque massive cut to all social spending, but massive cuts as well on taxes on the rich, which again resulted in a massive increase in the deficit. And she had no way of funding that. And the bond market, the gilt market rebelled. Now, of course, the U.S. Treasury market is much bigger and much more important systemically in the global financial system than the gilts, than the British bonds. But the point is that, we're hearing discussions of like the return of bond vigilantes and all this in the U.S. And the point is that, so Trump really wants to bring down interest rates, and he wants to bring down the 10-year treasury yield in order to bring down interest expense. So how can they do that? Well, a recession. I think it's very likely that there will be a recession. Because, well, I mean, it's hard to say because there are people who said that that maybe we've kind of been in like a quiet recession. But the thing is, because the US government was running a federal deficit of 6% of GDP, it was really a private sector recession. But because the public sector was running such a big deficit, it helped to balance the economy. So you did have what seems like a lot of growth in US GDP. But actually, some mainstream economists have pointed out that US federal debt is growing much faster than the GDP is growing. So that's why debt to GDP has been skyrocketing. So it does seem like Scott Bessent, he wants to actually have a full-on recession because, of course, if you're looking at it from the perspective of a kind of, Austrian school libertarian, they would say we have to clean up all of the zombie companies that rely on just rolling over their debt and we need this kind of Schumpeterian, cleaning everything up in the economy and the survival of the fittest. And then more importantly, from the perspective of the Trump administration, then you can massively cut interest rates. And then what happens? You can massively reduce interest expense because then you can have 10-year treasuries going back to 2% instead of right now they're like at 4.5%. So I think you hit the nail on the head. It's all distraction. They're not going to reduce the deficit. They're doing all of this to distract from the massive increases that we're going to see because they're going to cut taxes on the rich and cut taxes on corporations. And then they will try to reduce some of the deficit by simply bringing down the interest expense by engineering a recession, which probably the US economy was going to be in a recession anyway, but because of what they call fiscal dominance, the US massive deficits prevented it from going into recession. Well, now we have a government that doesn't care about unemployment increasing. They don't even have to pretend that they care about working class people. So, like I said, I expect what we saw under Reagan in the 80s. A lot of talk about cutting fat, cutting government spending, laying off federal workers. But at the end of the day, the federal deficit actually increases.
I think there is a little bit of nuance in the interest rates, though. Although, like both the 10-year Treasury yield and interest rates are always spoken at the same breath. I think there is a real contradiction within the Trump administration because they know that inflation it was a real issue that that led to a lot of anti-incumbency against Biden, and Trump seems to be very sensitive. Of course, he's speaking in different voices, but recently he said that well, the Fed is doing good work, in keeping interest rates, in allowing interest rates to handle inflation. And I think there is that real contradiction. On one hand, people like Scott Bessent would want the long-term 10-year treasury yield to come down, but I think they can't afford to lower short-term interest rates at the expense of inflation. So what they might do is they might they might lower the treasury yield a little bit and asking the Federal Reserves to assume a lot of those credit even on low yield. But there is a limit there because the private players are not going to tolerate that because if there is a huge mismatch between interest rates and treasury yield, then the gilt market would react. So
yeah, a few quick you hit the nail on the head. A few quick points really that I forgot to mention, but now that you mentioned that. There's also this very strange thing that's been happening in the US Treasury market, which is that in the past few months, the Fed was cutting rates and the 10-year yield was going up, which of course is the opposite of what you would normally expect. But people have been arguing endlessly about why this is. This is people saying, again, the investors revolting because they expect that in reality that inflation is going to go higher. We actually saw recently a much higher inflation figure in the most recent data. So people are worried that inflation could come back. Another reason that people are talking about is that foreign central banks are buying fewer securities, treasury securities, because they are afraid that the US could weaponize them and seize them like they did to Russia. So there are a lot of things happening in the US Treasury market that are unconventional. But there are so many things that the Trump administration could do. I mean, I think they are very serious about this. Scott Bessent is very serious about this. They could force the Fed. I mean, there's like the idea that the Fed is independent, we all know is a joke. I mean, it's completely political. This idea of central bank independence has always been a canard. But They could pressure the Fed to stop doing quantitative tightening and go back to quantitative easing, or at least stop quantitative tightening. They could do de facto yield control. There's so many things they could do. They have a lot of policy tools, but I think honestly, they're not at all opposed to just having a recession. I think that's a very real possibility because that would really it could help bring down the dollar, which has been very high. It could help reduce interest rates, and of course, they don't really care about unemployment increasing.
Let's switch from the US to geopolitics a little bit, and from Besant, the hedge fund, to Steve Witkoff, the real estate manager. And we are talking about this new Riviera real estate project based on the idea. It's not funny, although it's really laughable, but it's really fun. Like it's yeah, it's a joke, but it's also not a joke given what's going on in Gaza. Three things come to my mind about this so-called pronouncement, the Gaza plan. Either it's a nasty real estate lobby from Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump himself, and all the people they surround themselves with, or a Zionist pressure from Tel Aviv that says that we wanted to win the war, and our definition of war is not what we are getting now. We wanted to finish Hamas, and we want to do that. And Smotrich, for instance, was threatening to bring down the government prior to Netanyahu's departure from Washington, where he got the plan. So it can be that lobby, it can be a policy coming out of Tel Aviv directly, or it's genuine misunderstanding that these real estate enclaves in the Middle East that have come from a lot of petrodollar surplus can actually come up at any place just by a golden touch of the United States. What is this plan, and what do you think is driving this plan, especially given it has come right after the ceasefire, about which the Trump administration took a lot of credit?
Yeah, well, we've seen that the ceasefire is mostly a formality. Israel has been constantly violating the ceasefire, not only killing people, continuing to kill people in Gaza, but also in the occupied West Bank. And there's no Hamas in the West Bank. They can't use that as an excuse. And what we're seeing, I think, is it's the prelude to just mass ethnic cleansing and the continuation of genocide. I think the so-called ceasefire was just PR, just marketing. It's just the prelude. And now Trump is openly saying, yeah, we're just going to expel 2 million Palestinians. He actually said 1.7, 1.8 million. So some people have suspected that means that Trump was maybe because of course the president gets a daily intelligence briefing. Was he briefed on that number, 1.7 or 1.8 million? Does that mean that hundreds of thousands of Gazans have been killed in the past year and a half? Who knows? But the point is that, by the way,
interestingly, the number was very close to, let's say, the 176,000 numbers by Lancet months ago. And so that would be like, one would expect that by simple carb would be like somewhere around 300,000, which is a number if you match it.
Exactly, yeah. And Lancet just published another, this is, for people who don't know, this is the peer-reviewed medical journal. They published another article by medical experts showing the life expectancy in Gaza plummeting. I mean, it's just like, this is genocide. And so now Trump says, okay, we're going to solve, in scare quotes, this issue by expelling, ethnically cleansing all of the Palestinians in Gaza, and the U.S. is going to colonize it and own it. He said, we will control Gaza and own it. He used the term own. And then, of course, there's the aspect which is important, but it's not the main issue, which is that Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, are talking about building real estate. So there's this, this is like the late stage empire where these kinds of crimes that have been committed for many years, and they're bipartisan, certainly under Biden, Trump is just boasting about them. That's what's late about it, is that he's no longer even talking about, Trump, unlike Biden, he doesn't care about international law. He doesn't care about human rights. Biden, for PR reasons, Blinken would go out and say, international law, human rights, blah, blah, blah. But they would just constantly shred international law every single day and violate human rights on a secondly basis, every second. Trump doesn't even have the illusion. He's just taken the mask off of the face of US empire. And in the case of Gaza, I mean, this kind of blatant profiteering and corruption is common, but he's just openly boasting about it. On the day of his inauguration, he had a press conference in the White House, and Trump said, "Yeah, Gaza's very interesting. We can make some beautiful real estate there on waterfront property." Last year in 2024, at an event at Harvard University, Jared Kushner was interviewed, and he also talked about, he said, cleaning out the Palestinians from Gaza, which is blatant call for ethnic cleansing. He even used the term cleansing, clean. And then he said, yeah, we could build some waterfront property. So again, this is not new. I'm not saying that Biden wasn't basically doing the same thing, but Trump is just, he doesn't care about the presentation. He's like, yeah, we are an empire. We are colonialists, and we are going to seize any territory that we want. We're going to colonize Gaza. We're going to colonize Greenland. We're going to colonize the Panama Canal. We're going to threaten to colonize Canada. And who else knows? I mean, he's been in power for a few weeks, and those are just a few of the territories he wants to colonize. So, what's funny is there are people, I think, very naive people, who every time Trump says something like, yeah, maybe we'll cut the military budget, they just take it up as if he's going to do it. I mean, Trump is a con man. He always says these things that he never does. They're very naive. And he appointed, of course, Trump claimed that he was going to challenge the neoconservatives. And then he appointed numerous neocons to oversee his foreign policy, including Marco Rubio, the king of the neocons, who's obediently supported every single war, who called for the U.S. to invade Venezuela. He's Secretary of State. Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, is an insane neocon, a mouth-foaming neocon who used to go on Fox News and say that China was supporting the Mexican cartels and ISIS, and that the U.S. had to have preemptive attacks on Iran. This is the national security advisor saying that they wanted preemptive strikes on Iran. And then, of course, you have the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, who's a self-declared crusader, another insane neocon who wants war on Iran and China. Anyway, getting back to this Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, some of these naive people were like, oh my God, Marco Rubio said we're in a multipolar world. It's like, yeah, the Munich Security Conference, they just published their annual report, and it's called multipolarization. Everyone can now see we're in a multipolar world. Recognizing that is not a sign that they actually are going to try to end their warmongering policies. Now, if you listen to what Marco Rubio is saying, he was saying we're in a multipolar world and the U.S. empire must maintain its sphere of influence. And I know later you wanted to talk about Latin America. This is what all this is related to. When China or countries in the global south, especially in Latin America, when they talk about a multipolar world, they say we want to be in a post-imperial world, a world in which countries that were formerly colonized are allowed to pursue their own independent paths of development. That's what China means when it says multipolar world. That's not what Marco Rubio means. Marco Rubio means there are multiple large powers. We're in an era of great power competition, and the U.S. empire must reassert control over its sphere of influence, which is the entire Western Hemisphere, which means the U.S. wants to colonize Greenland. It wants to recolonize parts of Latin America, including the Panama Canal. It wants to impose control over Canada and Mexico. That's what they mean by a multipolar world. So Marco Rubio is not, going to be suddenly supporting the global south at all. It's the exact opposite. And this is all what we see now with Gaza. They're just saying, yeah, we are an empire. We're not going to talk about international law, and we're going to do whatever we want to maximize our power. Trump said that in his speech, his inauguration speech. Some of his naive supporters said, look, Trump said he's going to be a peace candidate. He's going to end war. Yeah, and then a minute later, he said, I am going to expand our territory and make us the strongest country ever. He said he invoked manifest destiny. So when Trump says, yeah, we're not going to have war, he means we're not going to have war with China and Russia because they can actually defend themselves. He means we're going to have war against small little territories that cannot defend themselves, like Greenland, like Gaza, like Panama.
Just to plug in, we recently did a full show on Guantanamo Bay. So those of you who haven't watched that, please do that, talking about Cuba. But Ben, I wanted to quickly have your response on Syria, since we haven't spoken since the collapse of Assad government. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about uh, the history, given there is a lot of amnesia about or a an acceptance of a propaganda that the Al Qaeda and ISIS and their clones, whether it's Jabhat al-Nusra or Ahrar al-Shams, they rejigged into some kind of moderate liberals, while the moderates who even existed during that uprising in 2011 just ended right there, ever since a lot of weapons moved into that. And so it was effectively a conflict between Assad on one hand and these radical forces on the other hand. So I wanted to have your thoughts about how you look at Syria and its implication in the Middle East.
It's a huge blow to national liberation movements, period, of all sorts. First of all, it's a major blow to the axis of resistance. It's not done, it's not dead, but it was a major blow to it. And it's a huge victory for US imperialism and Israeli colonialism. And it's also really the death, at least in the short to the medium term, of Arab nationalism, which, I mean, for all of the criticisms of the Syrian government, it was a post-colonial Arab state that had an Arab nationalist government that supported the Palestinian movement, that refused to normalize with Israeli colonialism, and was still trying to continue the legacy of Arab nationalism going back to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And the US, using Israel and Saudi Arabia, murderously crushed Arab nationalism. And of course, communism. We know that during the first Cold War. But after crushing communism, then their next target was Arab nationalism, always. And Israel was always an obedient US ally in the US empire's attempt to destroy Arab nationalism. In Palestine, of course, the Palestinian movement was led by Arab nationalist movements. Of course, there were communist groups like the PFLP, but the PLO was fundamentally, and Fatah was essentially an Arab nationalist movement, and that was completely co-opted by the U.S. and Israel. We see Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas today, who's just an obedient puppet, and then they crushed Arab nationalism in Iraq. They crushed Arab nationalism in Libya, destroying the Libyan state and killing Gaddafi, and they destroyed Arab nationalism in Syria. And here, so basically, the only options left in the region are reactionary monarchies, puppet regimes of the US like Jordan, or Salafi jihadists like in Syria, or of course, you still have Shia liberation theology. You have movements like Hezbollah, you have Ansar Allah in Yemen, of course, you have Iran. So the only strong resistance movements that actually have weapons and fighting forces that are remaining are, Islamic-oriented liberation theology movements, national liberation struggles. I would call them Islamic nationalism. Hamas as well. They're not Shia, but most of these groups are Shia-oriented. Those are the only remaining resistance groups. Of course, there is, a Lebanese Communist Party. There are small communist parties in Sudan. There are a few small Arab nationalist movements, but they don't have significant fighting forces. They've been defeated. They've been crushed by imperialism, which was the U.S. goal going back many decades, right? And now what we see is that the U.S. is saying we're going to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza, and no one's going to resist them. I mean, the only two states that would be willing to are Iran and Yemen, the de facto government of Yemen, and they're not strong enough to challenge the U.S. full on. They've been doing so indirectly, but Jordan is just a complete puppet. Saudi Arabia, for economic reasons, they've been kind of playing both sides because China is their largest trading partner. But when it comes to geopolitics, they're not going to do anything to challenge U.S. imperialism and Israeli colonialism. They would love to immediately normalize. MBS would love to normalize relations with Israel tomorrow if he could, but for legitimacy, for domestic reasons, these regimes can't look like they're participating and facilitating the ethnic cleansing, because then it would lead to the overthrow of these regimes, which are, they have no legitimacy locally, especially the Jordanian monarchy. It's a complete joke. People joke about how King Abdullah, his first language is English. They joke that he speaks Arabic with a gringo accent. I mean, there's no legitimacy to the Jordanian monarchy at all. The only reason that it remains in power is because it has been propped up by U.S. imperialism for decades. And that was true for the Saudi monarchy as well, which was created by the United States. Literally, the U.S. famously under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on FDR's last Valentine's Day, he had a meeting with King Ibn Saud, and he said, we will protect you as a regime. We will prop you up as a regime if you sell us your oil. And then, of course, after Nixon ended the link of the dollar to gold in 71, they created the petrodollar system, and they basically forced Saudi Arabia to sell its oil in dollars. And now, because China has become the largest trading partner of West Asia and by far the largest purchaser of oil from the Persian Gulf, these countries like Saudi and the UAE have to hedge their bets and play both sides economically because they rely so much on trade with the East. Geopolitically, they're not going to do anything at all to challenge Israeli colonialism. They've completely abandoned the Palestinians. The last king who actually did support the Palestinians in Saudi Arabia, he was assassinated. So there you go. Now, as for Syria, what is the regime? It's rebranded Al-Qaeda. I have to be honest, I'm actually surprised at how effective they've been at rebranding. Now he's even used a whole new name, his birth name, which is Ahmad al-Shara, right? Which is Muhammad al-Julani, which he was the leader of Al-Qaeda. He was the leader of the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate on earth, which is Jabhat al-Nusra. They rebranded as HTS, right? And then they also, by the way, I should point out, not only was he the leader of Al-Qaeda, he was previously affiliated with ISIS, with Baghdadi himself. And then he distanced himself from ISIS, and he said Al-Qaeda is not part of the international global Salafi jihadist struggle. We're only focusing on liberating, in scare quotes, Syria from
because
the Shia.
Also because Al-Qaeda was not seen as radical enough in 2012, 2013, when ISIS was rising. Even a lot of people were saying in Iraq, for instance, that Al-Qaeda in 2006-7 were much more moderate than the ISIS in 2013, 2014, when they were expanding their caliphate. Sorry for the interjection.
Yeah. No, that point is so important. And related to that, so if you look at the ideological battle that was happening, the reason that Julani, Shara, the name he's used, his birth name, Abu Muhammad al-Julani was his nom de guerre, right? And his birth name is Ahmad al-Shara. So that's why he's gone back to that name now. And he's been declared the leader, unelected leader of Syria. Well, the reason that when he was the leader of Al-Qaeda, that they split from ISIS, it was not over different. They weren't against the extremist Salafi jihadist ideology of ISIS. It was strictly a political decision because ISIS was internationally oriented. They wanted to expand. And the whole argument of Jabhat al-Nusra was, we don't want to expand right now. Our focus now is overthrowing the Syrian government, which they declared to be a polytheist, Rafadi, like that's the term they use for Shias, who they see as like non-Muslim Zoroastrians. They basically claim that they're not Muslims because they link Shia Islam back to Zoroastrianism, right? That's their whole insane, extremist, fundamentalist ideology. So their argument was, we need to focus on overthrowing the Syrian government and creating a Salafi jihadist caliphate only in Syria. We're not focused on the rest of the world. And then they rebranded. Clearly, he's been working with Qatar and working with some of the Gulf monarchies who have been paying for like marketing firms. And he put on a suit. He shaved he started, trimming his beard, and he's been very effective at rebranding, I got to say. And now they brought in a bunch of neoliberal economists to privatize the economy in Syria. They said we're gonna end the socialist policies of the Ba'athist regime. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of Syria because of partial liberalization. I mean, every single government basically was forced to liberalize the economy in the 90s and 2000s with the overthrow of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been the largest trading partner of Syria. It's a very small economy. It was, we all know the position of these small states in the global financial system controlled by the US. They were forced to implement partial liberalization and such. But if you look at Syria's economy compared to its neighbors, it still had, before the war in 2011, before the war destroyed the economy, they still had very strong social programs. They still had relatively strong local industry. Because of strong protectionist measures, they had very good education. I know a lot of people who went to study Arabic in Damascus because Arabic, of course, Levantine Arabic, Shami, is seen as like one of the better accents to learn because it's not like Egyptian Arabic, which is, very strong and, like the whole g, whatever. Like, like they pronounce the jim, like the J as like a g. Anyway, the point is that Syria was like a very popular place where foreign students would go to study Arabic, right? And it was very safe. It was relatively secular, like women could go out at night and stuff. And then they also had very good healthcare in Syria. I mean, Syria was destroyed as a state. And for all the criticisms, it had one of the best standards of living in the region for a country that's not just a rich oil monarchy that has like insane amounts of oil and gas. It was destroyed. And the last attempt, look what they did to Iraq. Obviously, Saddam Hussein, ironically, had been closely allied with the U.S. at certain points in the Iran-Iraq war and all this stuff and committed so many horrible crimes. I'm not trying to defend Saddam Hussein, but I'm saying look at the economy in Iraq. Very strong healthcare, very strong education, relatively secular compared to what happened later, relatively better women's rights, and strong local industry, strong unions. All of that destroyed. Again, I'm not defending Saddam Hussein or any of this. I'm pointing out that all of these states that had some kind of Arab nationalist project, that had some kind of nationalist economic policy, resource nationalism, investment in industry and healthcare and education, all destroyed. And what's the result? A combination of brutal neoliberalism and fundamentalist Salafi jihadists. And that's the future of Syria. I mean, it's really sad. And then, of course, finally, what are they doing with Israel? Completely allowing Israel to colonize Syrian territory. Syria declared the so-called annexation of the Golan Heights, which is, according to international law, illegally occupied. And what was the response of the Salafi jihadist fanatics who are now in charge in Syria? Nothing. The opposite of nothing. They said, we don't want a conflict with Israel, which is a green light to colonize Syrian territory. So you have all of these people who said, oh, Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'athists, they never actually supported the Palestinians because they never fought to liberate the Golan Heights. Well, that's actually false. They did try. Well, not Bashar al-Assad, but the Arab nationalist government of Syria previously had tried and failed. I mean, they did fail, but they at least tried. They did fight Israel. And now what's happening is the new Salafi jihadist Gulf-backed, US-backed, Israel-backed forces in power in Damascus have allowed Israel to colonize the Golan Heights, to expand their colonization of the Golan Heights, to seize the tallest mountain in Syria, which now Israel has created, turned into a spy hub to spy all on the forces around the region. This is a massive victory for Israel. It's a massive victory for US imperialism. And then you have these people who say, oh, well, I support Palestine, but I also opposed the only government in Syria that actually was willing to fight in support of the Palestinians against Israel. I mean, you cannot support, logically, consistently, you cannot say you support the liberation of the Palestinian people and you support the overthrow of the Syrian government. This is a massive blow. This is horrible.
Interestingly, Al-Jolani was born in occupied Golan Heights before he went to Saudi Arabia, came back to Iraq, became a
That's
governor.
where Al-Julani comes from. In Arabic, it's Al-Julan, the Golan Heights.
Right. I think like the mainstream media in the West has still, till date, has not admitted a lie that they spoke to their viewers in the West, that the West had a choice between Assad and what was almost entirely a radical Islamic jihadi cocktail. They kept on lying that what the West is backing is neither the ISIS nor the radical jihad, and there is this fictitious moderate groups, moderate liberals, which even to the extent it existed in 2011, immediately fizzled out if like the moment the United States, Turkey, and others started importing all that weapons into the region. And so the choice was very clear, and there were very clear recognition within the Obama administration, within various administration, that we can't win this war because there are so many contradictions. If ISIS becomes too weak, then Assad would become powerful, and so but we can't allow to do that. And that I think has never been disclosed openly by the mainstream media. I want to discuss Ukraine because one exception for me was that I was never sure about Trump administration's policy in Ukraine and Russia. I was very sure about a lot of his policies on China, on the Middle East, and on Latin America because there was a union. Like if you read enough, one could one could bring a pattern. But on Ukraine, I was always very confused. But you came on our show and you said that roughly speaking, there would be continuity. And I wanted to have your response now, how you still think about it, given like Pete Hegseth recently said quite openly that a return to Ukraine's 2014 borders is unrealistic objective, effectively watering down any possibility of Ukraine joining NATO or even like getting back areas that Russians have now occupied. And Trump has said that I'm soon starting talks to end this 3 year conflict. Um, how do you look at the U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia at this moment?
Yeah, well, I made it clear in the videos I did. I think I even said it in my interview with you that people can go back and check my record that I said regardless of who wins the U.S. presidency, whether it's Trump or Kamala or Biden, they're going to have to end the war in Ukraine because they lost. I said that again and again and again. What I said is what I'm not clear about, what I don't know is how the war will end, whether or not it will be something like the Korea situation, which I thought was more likely, where they just have a cessation of hostilities but they don't really have a permanent conclusion to the war, or if there's a formal peace treaty. I still don't, still today, I always thought that the Korea scenario was more likely. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Trump will find a way to negotiate a formal treaty to the end of the war. I'm still skeptical because Europe, there's no way Europe's going to go along with this. So maybe the US and Russia would sign it, but without Europe, I don't know. But I still think the Korea scenario is more on the table. But I always made it clear. I said even if Kamala and the Democrats win, they're going to have to end the war because they've lost. It's clear to everyone they've lost. So I really don't think this comment by Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, is that historic or that important. Because, what's funny is immediately after he said this, Mark Rutte, who's the new NATO secretary, he came out and basically said, yeah, Ukraine was never going to join NATO. We never promised Ukraine would join NATO. Now, of course, that's true, but it's something that's technically true in letter, but not in spirit. Because NATO's whole strategy for years was, okay, in the future, hypothetically, Ukraine could become part of NATO. So that was the kind of carrot they held in front of NATO as they held in front of Ukraine as they pushed Ukraine into the meat grinder of war, into war with Russia. They always said, it was one of these things of strategic ambiguity, right? Where the U.S. says, well, Ukraine is not part of NATO and is not going to be part of NATO, or it's not part of NATO, but maybe hypothetically in the future it could become part of NATO. So then now Pete Hegseth says, yeah, Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO. So again, the fact that the NATO secretary came out and said that it It was never policy. It shows this kind of policy of strategic ambiguity. But like I said, this is just a recognition that the US and NATO lost the war, that Ukraine has been devastated. It's so sad what they have done to Ukraine. They've destroyed an entire generation of Ukraine. They've devastated the economy. Look what they did to Ukraine even before the war. Look, even if you just simply look at GDP, and obviously there are many valid critiques of GDP because you can have GDP grow, but if all of that wealth is concentrated in a few hands, people's standard of living can fall. But even regardless of all the critiques of GDP, Ukraine's GDP before the war was basically around the level it had been in 1991. It took well over a decade to recover even remotely close to being where it had been when Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was destroyed as an economy. It was deindustrialized. It was devastated, all before they pushed it into the meat grinder of war. And then, of course, in 2004, there was the first color revolution, the Orange Revolution, right? Where Yanukovych came to power. He was pushed out. 2014, they had another. And by the way, the Guardian newspaper had an article boasting that it was the color revolution. This is back when they were open about that. In 2004, they talked about how the US, through all of these CIA cutouts, was funding all of the color revolution in Ukraine in 2004. And in 2014, the same thing happened basically, but even more violent. There was another color revolution, this time against Yanukovych, which led to a civil war, which was fueled by the US. And then Russia got involved as well. And then it led to where we are today. I mean, the war actually started in 2014. So, I mean, Ukraine has been devastated. It's been destroyed. And Trump's focus now is, like I said, what I was talking about earlier. When Marco Rubio acknowledges we're in a multipolar world, he's not using the term in the same sense that China and many global South countries use multipolar, which means a world without hegemony. It means a world in which global South countries are allowed to have breathing space, to have their own paths of development. So they're not just treated as semi-colonies. When Marco Rubio and Trump talk about multipolarity, or at least Marco Rubio, Trump doesn't say it, they mean the US is no longer the only unipolar power. It's one of several great powers, and the US needs to reassert its imperial spheres of influence. And they're saying Ukraine is not part of our sphere of influence. We lost. And we just need to accept that and focus on countering China and reimposing US hegemony in Latin America, which is really one of, and not just Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere. Greenland, Panama, that's the focus now of the Trump government.
Very quickly on Europe, given you said rightly that Europe is so critical to this US-Russia relationship in a way. Germany in particular, there is a rise of, not even rise, actually, there has been a very strong pro-Russian camp within Germany for economic reasons at the very least, because a lot of oil dependency for their manufacturers is very, very critical, and German economy being the old-fashioned export-led industrial economy. And this has been now supported by both the far right, like AfD, and the far left, Sarah Wagenknecht's party, which has been very, very vocal that we need to reset our relationship with the United States. This subservient relationship with the United States can't go on, and we also need to reset our relationship with Russia. Do you see, and there are talks about not just tariffs and trade, but also spending on NATO, and even the VAT, which is under fire in Europe, is very, very critical for Europe. In fact, there is a book, very good book, that says that the European so-called welfare state never came by very high levels of direct tax. It came through indirect tax. And so VAT is very, very important for them to even keep the bare minimum of welfare state that they have. So there are very sharp contradictions now, and I don't think the whole of Europe is like Japan and South Korea vis-a-vis United States. Like, they are not absolutely dependent. Like, they can be independent if they like, but their elites don't want to. So just wanted to have your response. Where do you see Europe going at this moment?
Well, quick note, I will say even in Japan and South Korea, we're seeing some murmurs of some politicians saying that they should reconsider their complete subservience to the US. Especially in South Korea, we'll see what happens. But with the end of a far right pro-US regime, we'll see there are politicians in South Korea who are saying that we should be much more neutral on China. We're destroying our economy by putting all of our eggs in the US basket. Even in Japan, the same thing's happening. But in Europe, I agree with you. I mean, Japan and South Korea remain militarily occupied by the US. Germany is also militarily occupied by the US, but not everyone in Europe is. And there have always been some political forces in Europe that have been a little more independently minded, especially in France. And unfortunately, there's such horrible leadership in France under Macron, who just he wants to be like this Charles de Gaulle figure, but he's also just, I mean, don't even get me started on the millionaire banker, president of the rich. I love that term that the French left uses for Macron, president of the rich. But the point is, in Europe overall, you're right that there's this massive emergence of far right movements, which is very funny because some of them portray themselves as nationalists, but in fact, some of them are even more obediently pro-US. They want the Trump government to be the one that tells them what to do, not a democratic government with a capital D, right? So this actually reminds me of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, where he had this whole rhetoric about being a nationalist and independent of the US and criticizing US hegemony. When Biden was president, as soon as Trump comes in, obediently following orders, doing everything that Trump wants. And some of the far right movements, also Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? When Trump was president, he had this very slavishly pro-US, just as pro-US as it gets, completely selling his country out, deindustrializing Brazil on behalf of US capital. I mean, doing everything that Trump wanted. And then Biden came in and suddenly there was a little friction, right? So similarly in Europe, I mean, this is actually what's funny. This is about the whole late stage empire thing, right? Because at the peak of US empire, it didn't matter who US president was. You had these countries that were obediently part of the US empire, and they would go along with whatever the US wanted, regardless of whether it was a Democrat or Republican. But this complete, just degradation of US imperial soft power has led to a significant politicization as well of the US empire, right? And now what we're seeing is that in Europe, you have some of these movements that when Biden was in power, they would criticize the US for the Ukraine war and such. And then now that Trump's in power, the far right forces in Europe are like, please, Emperor Trump, tell us what to do. So, like I said, I'm obviously completely skeptical of this whole European nationalism in scare quotes. It's very skin deep. They're not actually nationalists. They use that rhetoric when it's helpful, but when it comes to international finance capital, they're all fully on board with Wall Street and doing whatever with what Trump wants. But of course, you're right that there was a difference on the issue of Russia, which, especially in the case of Germany, is a matter of survival of the German industrial capitalist class. Because, Germany is one of these countries that still does have a national bourgeoisie that is still very powerful. And the comprador bourgeoisie in Germany, until recently, was not as powerful, although it's been gaining more influence. The international financial bourgeoisie, the compradors. And in the case of the German industrialists, they have always pushed for closer relations with Russia because they relied on Russian oil and Russian gas through Nord Stream, through other pipelines. And it was, let's not forget.
Also, German finance going into Russia. I mean, Germany doesn't have like a huge financial sector. So a lot of finance goes into Russia.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Deutsche Bank is still a very major bank. I mean, finance is complicated, obviously, because there still is a lot of international capital involved. But to the extent that there was, German financial capital, absolutely, a lot of interest there. And let's not forget, it was Angela Merkel, who, was the representative of the German capitalist class. Somewhat of this kind of, conservative nationalism. And she was the one who wanted to build Nord Stream. It was her project. And anyway, so getting back to this conflict now over Russia, it's good to see. What's really sad and what's really scary is that until recently, basically the only political force in Germany that was saying that why are we committing economic suicide on behalf of the US and NATO by completely destroying our relations with Russia. Unfortunately, it was almost only the far right saying that. And you do have now this new party of Sarah Wagenknecht. She was part of Die Linke, and there are some really good members of the Bundestag, like Sevim Dagdelen, a really solid left-wing anti-imperialist member of parliament, who's now part of Sarah Wagenknecht's party. And there were some of the few people on the left who were saying, why are we sacrificing our sovereignty because of the US and NATO? Why are we destroying our relations with Russia? They also, unlike the far right, the AfD, which is saying something similar, but the AfD totally supports US imperialism in Latin America. They totally support, European neocolonialism in Africa. They don't care at all about the global South. They're full European chauvinists. Unlike them, the left in Germany was saying we support national liberation movements in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and we want better relations and peace with China. So there are attempts by like the liberals, right, to have this whole BS horseshoe theory nonsense, which is totally BS. It's not true at all. That like the far left and the so-called far left in scare quotes, which is another BS term, and the far right are supposedly agreeing in everything. It's not true at all. On certain specific issues, like the issue of Russia, they don't have the same position, but they're critical of NATO and the US and the Ukraine war and want to improve relations with Russia. It doesn't mean they have the same position, right? So anyway, getting back to the rest of Europe, we talked about that in the case of Germany. In the case of France, this also exists, right? And there are a lot of people who say, why are we sacrificing our sovereignty and independence? Europe should be an independent pole. And this is not just the left. This is the French capitalist class, the national bourgeoisie, saying that we should be our own independent power and we should have better relations with Russia and even with China. And ironically, with Trump, antagonizing Europe, one of the very few positive aspects of that is it could push potentially Europe into a more independent foreign policy and to improve its relations with China. Whether or not it actually does, I'm still pretty skeptical because the European political class is just completely politically just subservient to the US. As I said, even the far right. The main difference is that the centrist forces, when a Democrat's in power in the US, they're more openly pro-US. And then when a Republican like Trump comes into power, they start kind of criticizing the US, but they don't actually do anything, right? So let's not forget that when Trump was in power the first time, France and Germany were talking about creating a pan-European standing army. They were talking about strategic autonomy. They created this INSTEC system with Iran to try to trade with Iran. They didn't do anything. It was all rhetoric. Nothing happened. So I'm still pretty skeptical about this whole nationalism in Europe or whatever. It's one final thought about this, which is very interesting, is that Trump and some of the European far right have this idea that they can do a reverse Kissingerian triangulation, right? So when Nixon, in 1971, Kissinger went to China. In 1972, Nixon went to China and they signed the Shanghai Communique and went on the path toward normalization of relations in 1979. So the US then was exploiting the Sino-Soviet split, which the US had always encouraged. I mean, the Sino-Soviet split is one of the most tragic developments in history. And it's really the main reason that the US won the first Cold War. That is, the US-led capitalist bloc won the first Cold War, which was a global class war. But the US took advantage of this, and then they normalized with China, and China, it never fully allied with the US, but it took this kind of position where they saw the Soviet Union as one of their main strategic adversaries, so they allowed the US to attack the Soviet Union and eventually overthrow the Soviet Union. So now they want to do the opposite. Now the idea they have is they can try to somehow recruit Russia into what they see as an alliance, or at the very least, they want to reduce Russia's strategic partnership with China in order to isolate China, to do to China what they did to the former Soviet Union. Now, I don't think that will be successful, but this is what Trump wants to do. This is even what recently, before the election, Trump did an interview with Tucker Carlson, and he said that. He said, why is Russia allied with China? Russia should be allied with us against China. That was Tucker Carlson's whole thing for a long time. And the whole Peter Thiel far right in the US and actually Steve Bannon called for it originally back in 2016, 2017, saying we should ally with Russia against China. Russiagate prevented them from doing that. Well, here we are a decade later, they're trying it again. but I don't think it's going to happen because Russia has already economically integrated so much with not just China, but with India, with Eurasia as a whole. It's a leading member of BRICS. And they're just, the US doesn't have that much it can offer Russia other than sanctions relief. But actually, the sanctions relief has actually, the sanctions have only encouraged Russia to deepen its integration with Eurasia and with Africa and the global south. So Trump thinks that he could do this. And even people like Marine Le Pen in France, she said the same thing. She said we want to move closer to Russia to weaken its relationship with China. So there are some people on the far right who want to try to do that in Europe, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, also like a difference I think in the early 70 moment was that US China normalization was to a great extent it was taught in economic terms. I mean, I'm not saying there was no military component to it, and it was helpful for China because China was until then very had to divert a lot of its resources to military because it was coming out of the that civil war that ended in 49 that never ended in a way, and it was always threatened. But here in the Russian case, I see they see Russia only as a military entity. So there is nothing really on the economic front that the United States have to offer Russia to even integrate Russia into the United States sphere. One final comment is earlier you mentioned about the PA. I just had this. It just struck me when you were saying that I think the big tragedy with liberal democracies, mostly in the global north, but also you're seeing that in parts of global south, is that kind of centrist parties lost massive legitimacy. And you are left with either like small right-wing groups, or sometimes in some cases you have left-wing groups being at least able to galvanize people. And it's what has happened to PA in the occupied West Bank. It has what happened in large parts, to a large degree with the Indian National Congress in India. Big loss of legitimacy, who once used to be a kind of center-left progressive nationalist party, and a lot of post-war left-wing labor parties and welfarist party in Europe. They, during the moment of neoliberalization, they lost legitimacy almost entirely. So they became completely depoliticized, and they ran the country as barons, not being responsive to people at all. And so the only alternatives that are emerging are at least people who talk about them. And that's the same has happened to the Democratic Party, by the way. So Trump gets a lot of eyeballs, or a DeSantis, because at least you can create a drama. You can talk about something that is of people's interest. To wrap it up, I want yeah.
One quick thought. I agree 100% with your analysis. Great points. I would add one other element to this, which is the global political element, right? Which is that during the first Cold War, right, which was really a global class war led by the US-led imperialist global north, the imperial core, not only against the Soviet Union, but against national liberation struggles. Let's not forget, against the non-aligned movement. Look at how the State Department talked about the non-aligned movement. They said they were all just crypto communists, right? So, and it's true. I mean, it's not true they were all crypto communists, which that's just typical US rhetoric. But it's true that almost all of the non-aligned movement leaders were socialists and left-wing nationalists. Look at all of the five main co-founders of the non-aligned movement. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, socialist. Sukarno in Indonesia, socialist. Oh, by the way, Nkrumah overthrown in a US-backed coup. Sukarno overthrown in a US-backed coup, followed by the mass genocide of the left in Indonesia in 65 and 66. The third was
Patrick Lumumba, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. Also, the third of the five main co-founders of the non-aligned movement was Nasser in Egypt. And Egyptian Arab nationalism was destroyed. And then also you had, of course, Tito in Yugoslavia. And then you have Nehru in India. And you've talked about how the Indian National Congress, it was, I mean, they wrote socialism into the Constitution of India. But as you know better than, certainly infinitely better than I do, that, they've abandoned some of that. Not entirely, but another example, South Africa, right? The ANC. South
Absolutely.
Africa is very similar history. And the point I wanted to make, though, is the global political element, which is that geopolitical element, which is that the reason that many of those parties were also able to pursue those independent paths of development is because they had another option, which was the Soviet Union. They had, during the First Cold War, they could balance those sides against each other and do what was in their interest, right? If you read Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, the point he makes in that book is that the non-aligned governments were not against, he famously says, we're not against foreign investment. What we're against is when foreign investment is used by the colonialist countries, the imperialist countries, to prevent our own domestic development. He said, we welcome foreign investment if it can develop our own capacities domestically, which is, of course, what China ended up doing. So, what's interesting about that whole history is that when the Soviet Union is overthrown in 91, and China is pursuing a policy under Deng Xiaoping, which is known as maintaining a low profile, lying low and biding your time, right? They weren't strong enough to challenge the US. So there was no other significant power that was able to challenge that. And what happens? Every country that refuses to give into that is either imposed, there are brutal sanctions imposed on them, or they're overthrown. Look what happened to Cuba. Look what happened to the DPRK in the 1990s, in the special period. It was brutal. It was really hard. The fact that they survived is a testament to the fact that, especially in the case of Cuba, that they still had a very popular revolutionary government, and despite the massive hardship. So you look at what happens in South Africa. Nelson Mandela comes to power. Everyone knows it's not so much of a secret that he was part of the South African Communist Party, and he was probably part of the Standing Committee. And he comes to power, and he has no option but to basically, it wasn't completely neoliberal, but to integrate South Africa into the US-led liberal international order. And now what we're seeing is, as the system is breaking apart, it will open up. This is the whole point about multipolarity that I've always been stressing. Multipolarity is not the solution to imperialism and all of these problems, but when you had unipolarity, US unipolarity, there was no option but to have your country integrated into the US-led international liberal financial order, which is what India tried to do, South Africa, all of these former left-wing anti-colonial movements were forced to move slowly toward neoliberalism, right? But now that that system is breaking apart and there's an increasing multipolar order, and you have China and Russia and other poles that offer not only political weight and military weight, but also even financing, as China became the largest international financer for global development financing, you can finally pursue more independent paths of development, which you were not allowed to pursue in the 90s and 2000s, because if you did, you would be overthrown in a coup or a color revolution, or there would be sanctions on you.
Absolutely. There is so much to say, but I won't do anything except for plugging in two more interviews with, as you mentioned, DPRK. We did a show with Bruce Cummins. People should watch that. And yeah, we also did one on Germany based on a recent book called as The Kaput. That will come after Ben's show, but do watch that show. You guys don't watch the shows that are less in the news but are extremely important. Ben, I want to, I'm coming towards the end, and I want to discuss a little bit of Latin America. All the rhetoric on Colombia, on Panama, on Mexico, there is this very subtle rhetoric, and people who are not a lot of people are discussing it. It's the China factor there. Oh, we force Chinese out of Panama. We would force Chinese out of this, out of that. And it is very, very clear that the new administration is extremely, very blatantly tightening its screw on the Western Hemisphere. It's like very open. Like Steve Bannon came in and said that we are very clear that we are ushering in a new Monroe Doctrine, which would be very, very harsh because, we can have debate about involving ourselves in the Middle East or, in the other side of the Pacific, but we need our sphere. And the China element is a complete concoction, and it reminds me of the old Soviet Union years, which was slightly different, and you can talk about it. But how do you look at the coming together of anti-China policies and rhetoric and anti-Latin America rhetoric together and unfolding that with the new Monroe Doctrine style that we are seeing?
It's really, really concerning. And honestly, it keeps me up at night. I spent several years living in Latin America. I go back every summer, and I'm a dual citizen of Nicaragua, and I'm very deeply involved in Latin American politics. And I think there is so much potential and so much hope for movements in Latin America. Look back at the history of the pink tide in the past 2 decades. I mean, so many great leaders that emerged, and of course they were targeted by the U.S. and destabilized, but were able to accomplish many good things. And now we're in this era where the U.S. government is saying that we are reasserting our imperial sphere of influence in Latin America and reimposing the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which is an explicitly colonial doctrine. And they're using it in the original sense of it. When it was declared in 1823, the idea was that the U.S. was a new emerging empire. It continued to expand with manifest destiny to the west, but it was also expanding south. This is a point that's often forgotten. In 1846, the U.S. invaded Mexico and colonized the northern half of Mexico. So you have states like Texas, California, Nevada. The reason that it's called New Mexico, the reason it's called Nevada, the reason that it's called, look at half of the names of those states. California is because those were the Spanish terms that were used in Mexico. That's why in Mexico there's Baja California, and then you have in the U.S. Alta California, the north, like higher and lower.
Also, the cities, right, in California, San this,
Yeah, San
San that.
Francisco,
Right.
Angeles, yeah, or all San Jose, also in Texas as well. So we can never forget that when the Monroe Doctrine was declared, the U.S. was still expanding. We still think of today, we think of the U.S. as this contingent territorially logical country. Of course, there's Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and foreign colonies, right? But we think of the U.S. as this, contiguous, consistent country from Pacific to Atlantic. But that's a pretty new development. And even as recently as the 1950s, that's when Hawaii was added as an official state. So the U.S. formally as an empire was expanding. And then, of course, we have Puerto Rico, which is a colony. And now Trump wants to add Greenland and Gaza and Panama. So the U.S. was always expanding as an empire formally, not just informally, right? And the Monroe Doctrine was declared at a time where the U.S. said, we will not tolerate European empires interfering in Latin America because it's our imperial sphere of influence. So what happened? In 1898, in the so-called Spanish-American War, the U.S.-Spanish War, the U.S. colonized Cuba, Puerto Rico, and also the Philippines. And the U.S. originally told some of the Cuban nationalists and revolutionaries, we will help you in your fight against Spanish colonialism. Now there was the left wing of the Cuban nationalist movement led by Jose Marti, who was always very skeptical of U.S. imperialism, and they recognized that the U.S. would be the new empire. But then there were more right-wing Cuban nationalists who allied with the U.S. empire against the Spanish, and then the U.S. simply replaced the Spanish, right? So the U.S. is going exactly back to the original meaning of the Monroe Doctrine, which is that European empires can't colonize Latin America. It's for us to colonize. Now, China is not interested in colonizing Latin America, not at all. That's the opposite of what China wants. But the U.S. wants to kick China out because the U.S. says this is our imperial sphere of influence. Now, why is China active in Latin America? It's their commercial, their economic relations. And why is that? Because Latin America has a lot of opportunities for increasing its trade with China as the large industrial superpower. The U.S. is deindustrialized. What is the U.S. going to offer Latin America? The US is the world's largest producer of oil. Well, Latin America has huge producers of oil. Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico. They don't need oil. While the US has a lot of food, its main agricultural producer. Well, basically every country in Latin America is a major agricultural producer. The U.S. it can export its debt, which is what it's done a lot. So that's the role it plays, is indebting these countries. China produces everything, every industrial product that these countries want. So obviously they're going to increase their trade with China, and China is going to increase its trade with Latin America. Now, another reason is that these countries have desperately needed infrastructure, desperately, and mathematically, the U.S. cannot provide it, even if the U.S. politically wanted to do so. This is not a point that I came up with. I give credit to this really good writer at the Asia Times who writes under a friend of mine who uses the pen name Han Feze. And he's pointed out that it's a mathematical impossibility of the U.S. to provide the development financing needed to the global south because the U.S. runs the world's largest current account deficit. China runs a massive current account surplus. And what did it do? Previously, it recycled those dollars into U.S. Treasury securities. But especially after the 2008 financial crisis, and especially after 2014, since then, the People's Bank of China has been a net seller of Treasury securities. It still buys some, but net, its holding of Treasury securities have declined since 2014. So what did China do it had more and more dollars. It lent those dollars for development financing. China became the world's largest development financier. And it gave more favorable conditions usually, which are often concessional lending at below market interest rates, and often had more favorable restructuring and forgiving. Look at Africa, for instance. China has forgiven billions in loans. And now there are people in the West who criticize China because China sometimes will not completely write off and forgive debt when countries also have IMF debt or when they have debt owed to US-based vulture funds, because China's whole point is that we have been willing to restructure and forgive debt, but we will do so when you also do it. But the US expects China to forgive and write off all of the debt that's owed to China, but not the debt that's owed to the IMF. The IMF as a position never forgives debt, ever.
They talk about debt trap, and it's so funny given the largest debt collecting mafia is the IMF. It's the largest debt collecting mafia, the feudal lord in human history.
And increasingly BlackRock and vulture funds on Wall Street. In fact, it's true the IMF has been a huge debt trapper, right? But what's funny is that the global south, it's actually really sad, but ironic, is that the global south learned in the 80s and 90s, in the lost decades, that they were trapped in this debt owed to the IMF. Well, they were trapped in debt originally owed to U.S. commercial banks, and then the IMF stepped in and bought up that debt and then became the new debt collector and imposed structural adjustment and neoliberal policies. So because of that period in the 2000s, countries in the global south said, okay, we can't lend from the IMF and the World Bank. Instead, we should just borrow on capital markets. So then you get in a whole new debt trap, which is that since the 2000s, the plurality of debt held by developing countries is owed to private creditors, is owed to Wall Street, is owed to hedge funds like, for instance, Elliott Management on Wall Street, which just carried out horrible vulture fund, just like blackmail against Argentina. And they bought up Argentina's defaulted bonds for pennies on the dollar. And then they used U.S. courts to take Argentina's government to court and sued Argentina to force the Argentine government to pay them billions of dollars in profits. To pay them the face value on the defaulted bonds they bought for pennies on the dollar. So, I mean, who are the biggest debt trappers in the world? Wall Street and the IMF. But then they say China. But anyway, the point is that mathematically, the U.S. cannot fund what Latin America wants and needs. So China can. China has this massive current account deficit. So instead of continuing to fund the U.S. and buy U.S. Treasury securities, China recycled those dollars into actually helping to develop countries. And of course, for China's perspective, it's not just benevolent. China gets a bunch of new trading partners, and it weakens China's trade dependence on the U.S. because the Obama administration, the Hillary Clinton State Department, made it clear. They said, yeah, we have a pivot to Asia. We're preparing for war on China. They said it. So China, logically, there are a lot of smart people running policy in China. They're not just run by like a bunch of real estate celebrities who win because, they have billions of dollars. Chinese policymakers are the smartest of the smart people. I mean, and they could see what was happening and they said, wow, we need to diversify our trade relations. We cannot continue with this system that has existed for 30 years where we export all of these goods to the US market, and that's ending. So instead, China said we need to increase our trade relations with the global south. And in order to do that, we have to provide the infrastructure to these countries because they simply cannot trade with us because they don't have ports, they don't have roads. And so they created Belt and Road. They recycled the dollars from their trade deficit with the trade surplus with the US trade deficit with China. They recycled those dollars into infrastructure, building ports and roads and hospitals and everything and schools in countries all around the world. And now, surprise, surprise, these countries trade more with China than they trade with the US, which isn't trade. The US doesn't offer them anything. China builds everything. So if you look at Latin America, China, if you exclude Mexico, which obviously is the southern neighbor of the US, if you exclude Mexico, China is the largest trading partner of South America and Latin America as a whole, excluding Mexico. If you look at Africa, China is the largest trading partner of most countries. If you look at West Asia, China is the largest trading partner. So here we are today where the US is telling countries in Latin America, you cannot trade with China. Okay, well, even right-wing leaders in Latin America, who are as pro-US as it gets, like the former Chilean president, Sebastián Piñera, even they, under their leadership, even under, for instance, under the Mauricio Macri, the former president, the right-wing president of Argentina, under both of their leadership, trade with China increased. Under Bolsonaro, who sold off state-owned companies in Brazil to the US and deregulated and everything that benefited US finance capital, trade with China still increased. Because the US can't, what is the US going to, the US cannot replace what China offers to these countries in terms of the capital goods and technology and in terms of the infrastructure. Mathematically, the US cannot finance infrastructure development in Latin America. US commercial banks can, but of course, US commercial banks are offering lending at market interest rates. China is offering concessional loans. So the Trump administration expects that they can just, the Biden administration, the Democrats, going back to Obama, they wanted to use the carrot, right? The carrot and stick approach. They wanted to try to pressure Latin America to reduce its relations with China by offering, very small amounts of development lending, which is a joke, pennies compared to what China can offer. And they say, well, you can be part of our club, right? We're going to have like an alliance of democracies. We're going to invite you to the Summit of the Americas. Not Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. You're not invited. But, they offered them nothing either. But it was rhetorical and all about, human rights and whatever.
They do
Trump
offer,
comes in and says,
they do offer
yeah.
people like Machado, Maria Corina Machado.
Yeah. Well, they also offer people, you can come and study. We'll give you scholarships to study in the US, and we'll create this new class of the elites who will be the leaders of your country. And this was famously exposed by this article in Politico by one of the former officials at USAID, who was boasting about how in Costa Rica and El Salvador, the first female president of Costa Rica and the first female vice president of El Salvador both worked for USAID. So that's what the Democrats offer is, we'll give you a job training program for your neoliberal elites to run your country. That was the carrot they offered. And actually for the Latin American elites, for the comprador elites, they like that deal, right? Because they go live in Miami and they have dual citizenship and they become very rich and they send their kids to study in Washington and whatever. Okay. So for them, there's a certain, I know these people in Latin America very well. They're even more pro-US than US politicians. They're the compradors, right? They exist in every Latin America, every global South country. There are these people in Asia and Africa. So that no longer is very attractive because China is offering objectively so much more, even to these horrible right-wing regimes in Latin America. Look at the Peruvian regime right now. It's a horrible, corrupt right-wing coup regime led by an unelected leader who helped carry out a coup against the elected left-wing populist leader, Pedro Castillo, who was imprisoned without trial. And now you have Dina Boluarte, who is just selling off her country to the US, to US finance capital. But ironically, even before years before she came to power, a Peruvian mining company signed a deal with China to build a huge port in Peru because the US can't build that. First of all, the US can't finance it. And second of all, the US doesn't even have the know how. The US can barely build infrastructure in its own country where infrastructure is crumbling. Yet alone, I mean, look at the attempt to build a pier in Gaza, which collapsed in like 2 days. China is building the best infrastructure in the world. So, a private company in Peru, a mining company called Volcan, they asked China to help them build this massive port in a joint venture. And now, what happened? It finished under Dina Boluarte, and she tries to take credit for it, even though she had nothing to do with this project in Peru. The point I'm making is that China's offering things the US can't offer. What did the US offer Peru? Antony Blinken went and he announced that they were giving trains from the 1980s. I kid you not, this is not a joke. China, President Xi was in Latin America for a meeting of this APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Group. And so he was there for this meeting, and then while he was there, China inaugurated this port of Chancay, this mega port, which cost billions of dollars in Peru. Because that happened, the U.S. was like, "Oh man, we have to find a way," because the U.S. is part of this Asia Pacific Economic Group as well. So they said we have to give something to Peru. We can't go empty-handed. So we're gonna pretend like we gave, in scare quotes, Lima $40 million of trains that actually they bought. It was not given. It was not a gift, even though the Biden administration claimed they gave it. And there are trains from the 1980s that the city of Lima bought from the state of California because the state of California finally was brought into the 21st century and invested in electric trains. And then they had all these old diesel trains from the 80s that they sold to Peru. That's what the US can offer. So it's no surprise that in Latin America, even some of the right-wing forces are saying, well, we have to continue to trade with China and we have to accept this development financing because the US can't offer to us. So Trump comes in and says, okay, well, no more carrots, pure stick. We're going back to the stick. We have to threaten these countries, impose sanctions and tariffs, more coups, potential invasions. I'm really concerned. I think Trump's going to invade Mexico. I'm not joking. It's not going to be like a full-on Afghanistan style with tens or hundreds of thousands of troops, but they're going to send in troops to Mexico. He's been talking about this for years. I mean, they're going to go full-on and colonialist because they cannot offer Latin America anything. They can offer a small handful of capitalist elites in Latin America. They can make them richer, but they cannot offer anything to the region. So they're going to get rid of the carrots and go full back to the stick and neocolonialism and the Monroe Doctrine.
That's absolutely what is my reading from a distance on the region. Ben, thank you so much for your time, and this was such a good conversation. Thanks.
My pleasure. Keep up the great work. I always love the work that you all do at Indian Global Left, so keep it up.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.